You can open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 18. Genesis chapter 18. We are today in the second message, second of two, over the Toldot section of Terah, which is primarily about Abraham and all that God has done in his life, and the forward progress and the incredible steps that the promises of God, the purposes of God take in the forward direction in his life. The first message I had titled Humble Beginnings for God's Plan of Blessing. And we'd considered a lot of things in Abram's life and where he was and the kind of man that he was. He was, of course, an out-and-out pagan when things began. We've seen tremendous growth. We've ended that first message with Genesis chapter 17 and God coming to Abram, changing his name to Abraham, changing Sarai's name to Sarah, and promising the birth of a son through Sarah. Of course, Abram wasn't agreeable to that at first and was pleading for his son Isaac, whom he had loved dearly, and was now 13 years old and had for 13 years been assumed to be the promised seed that Abram would have. But all that is in the context of this covenant of circumcision, and I just want to bring that out just to remind you. Abram started as a pagan, worshiping false gods. God has begun in his life and continued to work in his life and teach him through many ups and downs to build his faith, to make him greater promises, and here to enact another covenant with him. And this covenant of circumcision, which would have meant something like for Abraham, and we find it in the words of the Lord as well as he describes it, that it's time for Abram to renew his commitment again to God, to living a righteous life, to being the blessing in the world that God called him to be, to see himself as a consecrated individual and all his house as consecrated unto God. All the world may do whatever it is they will, but he's consecrated to God. And this mark of circumcision represented that. It represented his commitment to God, his priestly nature in the world as related to God. He was going to be God's man in the world, and his family would be God's people in the world. And in turn, they would have God's provision and protection and all the other things that God had promised to bring about. And so, on the heels of this fresh commitment, and then these new promises of what God was going to do, provide this son, Abram turns right around, and that very day is circumcised, has his son Ishmael circumcised, and all the men in his house were circumcised that very day. Abram was absolutely serious about this. There was no hesitation. He didn't wait a month. He didn't wait 6 months. He didn't think one day maybe we'll do this. I'm not sure if we're ready for this. He immediately obeyed God in this act. And this is profound. And if we don't remember that this is the place we are in now, where Abram is freshly devoted to God, we've just come off this matter of circumcision and this covenant, then we kind of miss the trajectory of things in chapter 18 and how things start. And we miss a little bit of we don't understand some of Abraham's actions if we don't remember that. So that's why I bring that up. So today then our goal is to get from Genesis chapter 18 all the way into chapter 25. So, it's 7.5 chapters. Of course, in the middle of that is chapter 19, which last time when we were going through all of this and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19, we dismissed the children for a couple of messages as we discussed all of that. I don't intend to dismiss any children this time, so we will go through that material in a little bit different way and not as graphic a way as we work our way through. So that's where we are. So what I'd like to do is pray and ask for the Lord's help in what remains, that the important things and the weightiness of all of this, the trajectory of the story would land on us in ways that we can carry with us for years to come. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, we again come and gather together as a body of your people, bought, redeemed, loved by you, many of us, and we pray, Lord, that you would be kind to us now and open your word and make it plain. We know in your word is life, and we need that. We want to receive this eternal word of God, the seed of the word of God. And so help us in this, to receive it, that it would bear much fruit in the years to come, bring clarity where maybe there's not, bring to our remembrance things we've heard before, that all of this would fit together in our hearts and minds in ways that it ought to. Things would just lock in place for us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, in Genesis chapter 18, we read in verse 1, "And the Lord appeared to him," that is to Abraham now, "by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day." And I want to just remind you that there are two purposes, at least two purposes for God's visit to Abraham. The first visit is to specify the birth of Isaac and make that clear to Sarah. Shockingly, so far Abram has said nothing to Sarah about the reason for her name change or to expect a child about this time next year. It's amazing. You'd think that would be relevant, but it hasn't happened yet. Now, in fairness, the very same day that God appeared in Genesis 17 to Abram, he went and circumcised all these men, and the message in Genesis 17 by God was, about this time next year, she's going to have a child. In Genesis chapter 18, the same message appears. This time he speaks to Sarah, about this time next year, you'll have a child. So it's not as if 6 months have gone on or whatever. It hasn't been much time. A few days, a few weeks, I don't know. So this is where we are. Now, God has two purposes. One is to make this clear to Sarah, and by declaring his intention at the beginning and then being able to fulfill it later when it didn't look possible, he will gain in the hearts of Abraham and in the hearts of Sarah greater faith and confidence in himself. Right? It would be one thing just to show up a year later and say, hey, you got the kid, like I said. It's kind of like the skeptic on all of us would say, well, it was just circumstance. But if God can say it in advance, this is never going to happen except I make it happen, and I will make it happen, and this is the time at which it will happen, and then it occurs, well, then you're more likely to credit him with doing it. And so it would build faith. And the second reason for his appearance at this time is to teach Abraham more about the righteous character of God through this upcoming judgment of Sodom. God knows he's getting ready to judge Sodom, but he wants to include Abraham in the judgment and in the reasoning behind it, and have these discussions with Abraham. Those are the two reasons for God's appearance to him. The Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. But we might be tempted to think there were three purposes, and I just want to say there weren't. Abraham sees these men, and we'll read this in a minute, as these men are walking by on their way, he doesn't know where, but actually they're on their way to Sodom. And he runs out there to meet them and stop them and bring them in to show them hospitality and to bless them. And in the process of that, he becomes aware that it's God Almighty whom he has been serving. He didn't know that, but he finds that out in time. And one of the things God tells him as he's talking here is he's saying, look, I'm going to go judge Sodom, and this is what's going on there, and we're going to go investigate. But when the investigation happens and the destruction of Sodom happens, it's just the two other men, not the three men. The Lord himself stays with Abram and then leaves. So God himself wasn't on his way to go to destroy Sodom. He came, it's as though God was going to send these messengers, but he says, but wait, I'm going to travel with you part way because there's a man on the way that I want to talk to. And he has that conversation, and the Lord leaves. But he sends on these two men, these two angels, to go on to Sodom. And so God's purpose isn't to go bring judgment, but to rather, his purpose is he's got to go talk to Abram. God's seeking audience with Abraham and Sarah. God's not personally going to Sodom. He's coming insofar as to see what will Abraham do. Now, Abraham has just been reminded in chapter 17 by God of his great need to be a blessing with all of that God has given him in this land. And what do we see but that the Lord personally put him to the test to see how much he would do this? You could imagine, we are told in the New Testament to practice hospitality, because by practicing hospitality, some people, and big hint, these are some people here, have unknowingly entertained angels in a way they were unaware of it, but they found that as they were doing these things, practicing hospitality, lo and behold, they were angels they were ministering to. What a blessing that would be. And so here's Abraham, and you could imagine, let's suppose he didn't run out there. He could have ministered, he could have blessed in some way God, showed a gesture to God, but he missed it, and these angels, and he would have missed it all. And so it's a bit of a test. It's not just God's looking to see about what he does to these passers-by, but God himself came and said, let's see if he's not going to recognize me, he's not going to know who I am, but let's see what he'll do. And it's wonderful to see. Verse 2, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, let me back up. Verse 1 says, the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre. Moses is telling us what Abraham doesn't know yet. It was God who appeared. So we know, we have knowledge Abraham doesn't. So Abraham in verse 2 though, just lifts up, he's out, it's hot outside, he's by his tent, at the door of the tent there, and he looks up and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him, some distance off, we'll see. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, my Lord, if I found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you've come to your servant. In other words, your travels have brought you by my front door. And anybody that passes by my front door gets help. Come on. Let me do all these things for you and serve you in this way, and then you can go on. Go on your journey. I don't mean to interfere, but since you've been so fortunate as to come across my front door, let me do these things for you. It's wonderful. So they said, do as you've said. And Abram went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, quick! 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. So it took a while. You don't kill an animal and carve it up and cook it in 20 minutes. But I'm sure it took them less time than it might take one of you or me, right? I don't know where to start on some of that stuff, right? Like, what are we going to cook it now, right? But so, no doubt, Sarah and Abraham weren't doing a lot of this personally. They were telling this servant, quick, do this, do that. And, he tells Sarah to do this, and she probably didn't do it all herself. She had many servants herself, and she was in charge of that. Got all these things done. It was, after all, a lot of food. He says to get 3 seahs of flour and knead it and make cakes. A seah, it says about 7.3 liters. Do you realize how much flour to get through? So 21 liters of flour. We're talking about a lot of food. This is not what these guys are going to eat in a meal. They're going to take with them. They're set probably for the rest of their journey, wherever they're headed. And so quite a thing. So here he is. And he goes out there once it's all made, and he has it prepared, and he sets it before them, and he stands by them under the tree while they ate. He's not eating with them even. He's just serving them. What do you need? And they said to him, this would be shocking, where is Sarah, your wife? Like they used the new name. She doesn't even know the name yet. Or maybe she's heard him say it, she's like, why are you saying my name like that now? Stop it. You're teasing me or whatever, like she doesn't even understand the reason for this name yet. They said, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, well, she's in the tent. And the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next. Now, Abram doesn't know it's the Lord. But the Lord says, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and advanced in years, and the way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So, because that was true, because she was so old and he was so old, she did what anyone would do. She laughed. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? Shall I really have a son? Shall I have the delight of being a mother after all these years? No, she laughs it off. This guy, I don't know who came by here, but this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I don't know how he knows my name, but he's a fool. And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Of course, remember, Sarah's inside the tent, and it's not, it's not clear. Now, she's not out there with them, so he's got that knowledge. She's in there saying this. They're close enough, though, that Sarah can hear what their conversation and things, and her laughter must have been heard, and somehow the Lord knew even what she said. And he says, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? For Yahweh. He uses his personal name. Is anything too hard for Yahweh? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down toward Sodom. Well, we could stop there. So that instance with Sarah, she tries to cover up what she had done, and there's a lesson for us there, just in the sense that one of the reasons I think this is recorded is to show us just how wonderful it is what God did for them, and that it wasn't just that it was unlikely; it's that they themselves had put it out of their mind as even a possibility. And even in the face of their own unbelief, God did it anyway. And that practical application, of course, for us is it's the same thing with us. God will do things in your life that if you're going to be honest and really help people with telling them the truth of what happened, you're not going to come out looking really good. Like you're going to have to tell all these, I didn't believe God here, and I was disobedient here, and I did this thing wrong. But look at what God had done. And if the point is to highlight God's faithfulness, well, then that's no problem. But if the point is that we want to look good, well, then we skip all these details, right? And she kind of tried to cover it up, and God said, no, you're going to remember. Your son's even going to bear the name Laughter. It's going to have a different meaning when he's born. You're going to laugh in different ways, but for now, no one's ever going to forget that you laughed at this. You never believed it until it happened. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them. So that was the first intention of the purpose of the visit. Now the second one. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that let's think of this. Abraham's there with these guys, and one of them, the one who told him, told him about what was going to happen with Sarah, and then called Sarah out for what she'd done. This guy, who he doesn't quite know who he is, but he's really concerned, like, how does this guy know all these things? Why is he talking this way? This guy just says to the others, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him. And now Abraham starts realizing who this is. For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that Yahweh may bring to Abraham what he's promised him. And then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. So he's revealing these things to Abraham, and he's doing it so that Abraham learns these things, so that Abraham, having learned these things, can live according to them and can pass them on to his descendants. So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. And you could almost say stood still before the Lord. It's like, yes, he still stood there, but you can bet he stood still, right? And so here he is. Then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Who does he think he's speaking to? The judge of all the earth. He knows it. He's got it 100% now. This is God he's speaking to. And so these men, these two other men, these angels in the appearance of men, they leave, head toward Sodom, and Abram stays there. You could imagine the wheels are turning, and hearing this, that God is saying, look, I don't want to hide this. I want him to learn about righteousness and justice, and thinking about what things he's going to pass on to his descendants, and this is important for him to learn. He's heard God say that, and then he's heard God say, now this is what I'm getting ready to do. I've heard a lot of bad things about Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm going to go down there, check it out, and then if it's the way it is, then I'm going to overthrow that city. And Abram just sits there. These men leave, and he's still sitting there thinking. And then he draws near to this man, to God. He says, okay, you've told me that this is all a lesson about righteousness and justice and judgment, sin, and the way God, and equity, the way God handles these things. The judge of all the earth, will he do right? It's got me thinking in these ways, as I know it wants you want me to, and so I've got questions for you. Part of something of what you've said sounds like it might not be just. I'm wrestling with this, and I don't understand. So please understand, the ESV has a heading, and I don't know what the NASB has, but it says Abraham intercedes for Sodom, which he's not interceding for them. He's not trying to get God to not judge them. He's trying to understand God's judgment. It's a philosophical and a theological question. And he gets to ask his questions to God. You know, how many times do Christians say, when I ever get to heaven, I want to ask God such and such? Abraham has an opportunity. God said, I'm getting ready to do this. Any questions? I've got one. First question. I mean, if there were 50 people that are not like the rest, that are righteous. I mean, I know Sodom wasn't great. I know some of these people. I rescued some of them. You helped me do that. And it was bad. And when we were coming back, and the kinds of things that people were saying and doing, it was awful. But if there were 50 righteous people, you wouldn't overthrow the whole city for that, would you? I mean, far be it. That's not like you. It doesn't appear to be and seem to be right and just, and certainly doesn't fit with what I've learned of you so far. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, look, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I'll spare the whole place. Nobody will suffer for their sake. Yeah, don't worry. It's not like there's going to be 50 people there that are righteous and they die with all the others. Actually, it'll be the opposite. I'll let everybody live for their sake. That's how forbearing I am. And Abraham answered and said, he said 50. Maybe I shouldn't have used that term. I've asked you one question. I'm but dust and ashes. I acknowledge my thoughts here might be totally off. But I'm slow. I'm dust and ashes. And I have another question. Suppose 5 of the... You said you were willing to do this. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Would you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? If you said... Are you the kind of God that said, if I'm going to go look at things, and if they meet this standard, I'll let everybody live? but if they're even a little short of that, I'm going to kill them all. Is that the way you are? Like, is it just, it has to be this standard, it's all or nothing? What would you do? And he says, well, look, I won't destroy it if I find 45 there. It's not just it has to be 50, even 45. I wouldn't destroy it. Not only would I not destroy those 45, I wouldn't destroy the whole place. None of them. And Abraham's realizing it's like he should be asking better questions. So he spoke to him, suppose 40 are found. What about 5 less? Well, for the sake of 40, I won't do it. Well, okay. Please don't be mad at me. Right? He says, verse 30, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I'll speak. Suppose, we went 5 and went 5 again. Let's go 10. Let's go down 10. See what how willing is he? Let's go down 10 more. Suppose 30 are there. And he answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. If there are 30 righteous people there, I will not destroy the city. Behold, I've undertaken to speak to the Lord. And another question. Let's try that again. Suppose 20. Just 20. How low can we get the number? Suppose 20 are there. And he answered, for the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, oh, all right. All right, one more question. Don't be angry, and I'll speak again. But this one time, just one question. Suppose there really are only 10 that are there. He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way. So then the Lord left. Like he said it was the last question, and the Lord held him to it. He just walked off. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham. It doesn't say when Abraham had finished speaking to him, when he finished speaking to Abraham. And Abraham returned to his place. So God cut the conversation off. Like there could have been more questions asked, but God cut it off and left. So God leaves Abraham on this precipice of thinking, this judgment's may come, and there's going to investigate, and if there are 10 righteous people in this town, then the whole town will be saved. But if there are not 10 people that the Lord considers righteous, then it's going to be overturned. It's going to be destroyed. It's okay. So this is the end, what happens. Then in most of chapter 19, the first half, we read about that investigation as to what happens. And it's awful, right? Just to summary fashion, right? These 2 men come into town. Lot shows his righteousness. Now, let's say this. Let's think about, imagine you're Abraham, and you're thinking about, my nephew Lot is over there. Is your opinion of Lot that he's a righteous man if you're Abraham? Like, probably not really. I mean, he's not like the Canaanites in this place have been, but he kind of did you dirty the last time you had dealings with him. And you were cast on God, and God said, look, I don't care what Lot does. I'm going to uphold you, and I'm going to give you this land despite what your nephew did. So Lot himself isn't really particularly a righteous man as we might count righteousness. We might consider you got to be perfect before God, and he wasn't that. But in the story, now, let me jump ahead to 19:27. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. He doesn't know at that point that Lot was spared. We know it, but all he knows is God did in fact judge. He learns later, and we're never told about this reunion necessarily, but he learns later about the incident and how it all went down and all of that. That is something he learns later. So for Abraham, this lesson is not all learned at once. He learns that first he sees God judge, and then he gets more information, and the lesson deepens. Does that make sense? Over time. So we don't read later about Abraham getting this news and then relearning on something else. We're just supposed to compress all this together. The lesson Abraham learned is the lesson we can learn by following this story through, but know that Abraham learned it in pieces. Now, so these men come. Lot is there in the gate of the city. He had become evidently a respected statesman, kind of in a sense there, or he had at least did business with the Sodomites on a level that required regular interaction with the city elders, at least that much. It looks like he was a respected man in general in the town, but still very much a foreigner. And so he's moved into town now. He started out outside of town. Now he's moved into town. He's a well-known figure. And when these men come in, you might ask, what is Lot doing at the gate of the city? I think he's doing a couple things. One, that was his regular place where he was. But two, it's near nightfall, and Lot is out there at the gate of the city eagerly looking for people coming in who don't seem like they belong and might be taken advantage of. If you've ever been in certain places that are just rough, it's pretty easy to see people come in who just don't seem to belong. It's very evident, like this person's got, like, it's like going, it's like, you know, a bunch of pickpockets maybe, they can spot the tourist, right? It's this kind of thing. Oh, they know you don't have a chance in this place, right? And these guys come in, and whatever they look like, they don't look like locals. They don't look like they fit. They don't look like they belong. They don't look like they've come there to do what is normally done at evening time at Sodom. And so Lot is concerned that they not be taken advantage of. And so he comes, and he comes to them. It says, "My lords, please," verse 2, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet, that you may rise up early and go on your way." Now, this is a curious thing. Imagine someone coming to your town, and you meet them at the city limits, and you say, "Hey, listen, they're coming to your town." And you say, "Hey, listen, come to my house, and you get in here, and you quickly, come on, hurry up, and we'll wash up, and I'll feed you, and you'll be rested, and then as soon as the morning comes, you can get on out of your way. Get going." You'd think, well, like, you don't talk that way unless you're trying. It's very evident there's something about this town that you're afraid that they're going to experience or get involved in. You want to get them quickly in and out before they're detected or noticed or anything, before they have any dealings. That says a lot about how Lot felt about the town he was living in, which is why the New Testament can say, like, Lot was, he was vexed every day as he saw these things happening. Because it's just right there in the text for us. Just think about what he's saying. This is crazy. And they say, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Here again you see the righteousness of Lot in that this hospitality is similar to Abraham's. This is good. He's doing well. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, everybody surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" Right? And they come and they want to know these men in a carnal way. These visitors who've come. And Lot presses them. "No, I'm not going to let you do it." And it's a stunning scene that we find. The men are pressing their way in, trying to take them. Lot steps out, remember, to plead with the men, and they turn toward him, and then the angels rescue him. Lot makes this statement, though, that is shocking. It's where he tells them, verse 8, "I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." And I used to read all that and think, what a callous man. How could a man who does that ever be a righteous man? And I hope you remember the alternative interpretation I gave when we went through this last time, but I'm going to give it again. I think it's one of the most misunderstood parts of the passage. I'm so thankful that I've come to understand it differently because the whole text makes so much more sense. Most people understand Lot to be willingly offering his daughters in the same way that eventually a Levite willingly offered his concubines in Judges 19. And that would be inexcusable and one of the greatest reasons for having such difficulty believing that Lot could be a righteous man, as Peter says that he was. But I think this could be understood other ways. First of all, it could be understood as hyperbolic language, meant to shock the men. Do what seems right to you to do to them. Could be interjecting the idea of what seems right into the situation. And also by changing their actions to having to do with his own daughters and not these foreigners who came in. Lot had an important place in the city. To violate his daughters in some way would be an offense in the city itself, would be not acceptable in many ways. Kind of hope they snap out of it. It might be something like, I don't think this is the best alternative interpretation, but it's one. Could be something like if someone comes to collect a debt from you and you say, well, why don't you just take the food off my kid's plate? Here, you want the shirt off my back? Like you're saying it, but you don't intend for them to take you up on it. The statement is meant to shock them about how wrong it is what they're doing, and maybe they back off and decide to leave off what they were going to do. And so that's a very possible way to say, look, I've got 2 daughters. You want to just take my 2 daughters and take them out and just do whatever you want with them, whatever seems proper to you guys, you upstanding citizens of Sodom, and hope they just realize, wait a minute, like look, maybe a couple of them start talking the others down or something. But it could also be that Lot is appealing to their own laws as a way to stop them. And this is what I think is more likely. Almost every place in the ancient world had strict laws concerning a betrothed woman and her soon-to-be husband. She was not to be touched or lied with by anyone except that person would suffer the most severe of consequences. Lot's daughters are betrothed to be married. He has son-in-law. That's kind of what laws are applying here. Sons-in-law. But yet his daughters still live with him, which would put them in a place where they were betrothed. They were committed to marry, a marriage had been arranged and agreed to, but not yet completed. And to lie with a woman in that period of time would have severe consequences. And to offer, say, look, I mean, you're not going to have these men. They've come under the protection of my roof. I would sooner give you my 2 daughters. Which doesn't mean I'm ready to do that, but rather the idea is they wouldn't cross that line, because that would have strict legal penalties in Sodom. There are men there who are considered Lot's sons-in-law, yet they themselves are still living at their father's house. So to violate these women would have severe consequences. Now, the men of Sodom are greater sinners than the rest, so maybe this wouldn't work, but perhaps. The point is, you don't have to read Lot's words as a real willingness on his part to have his daughters brought out to these men. It's very possible that if these men would have agreed, Lot would have been all the more outraged at their wickedness and refused their requests, even then. Say, you cannot be, no, I would rather die than that. And they'd say, okay, we'll take you, like they tried to do anyway. But it doesn't mean he has to be a willing partner in offering up his daughters. He's just trying to, I think, rebuff the men and reason with them in some ways. Verse 9, but they say, stand back. And they said, this fellow came to sojourn, that is you, Lot. You came just here to live here for a while, and now you've become the judge. Now we'll deal worse with you than with them. And they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. But these men in his house reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door, and they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door. Now, it's one thing to be struck with blindness. That's a miracle in itself. But these men are so incensed and so enraged, they're so sinful and vile, that even after being struck with blindness, they continue. It says they wear themselves out, groping for the door. They're fighting over each other and with each other, trying to get at the door, to figure out a way to open it up, in spite of it being locked, to get in there and get these men. This is incredible. What kind of a rage or a mental state do you have to be in to be struck with blindness and continue on until you wear yourself out? And then these men inside Lot's home said, have you anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place. For we're about to destroy this place, because the outcry against this people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. Isn't that amazing? They thought he was joking. Like, what are these? Why do you think? I mean, all this kind of big commotion happened over there at Lot's house, and now Lot's, all worried, and he's all worked up, and now he thinks God's going to just destroy it now. Silly Lot. I thought he was joking. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. Now this is amazing. Don't miss this. How many righteous men are in the city? Are there less than 10? Certainly. There is maybe 1 Lot. His sons-in-law, they think it's a big joke. There's just Lot. But it's far from just destroying even the one relatively righteous man, just compared to the others, God actually is pleading with him to get out and holding back the judgment a little longer so that he could get out, giving him instructions. And then that man, this is incredible, they actually grab him and his daughters and his wife and bring them out of the city. Lot still won't go. They grab him and physically escort them out, driving them, in a sense, out of the city the same way Adam and Eve had to be driven out of the garden. Get out! This isn't paradise. This place is doomed. Run! And Lot says to them, "Oh, no, we can't go up to the hills. That's too far. Behold, if I found favor in your sight and you've shown me great kindness in saving my life, but I can't escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city over here, it's near enough to flee to, and it's a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one, and my life will be saved?" So think of this. Now we've gone from, would God destroy all the inhabitants for 10 righteous? Now, there's only one, and he's kind of righteous, and he's even pleading to not even, that the people not be destroyed at all, that God not execute the judgment that they deserve. And then they're rescuing him, going out of their way to rescue him, and he's arguing with him about how he's going to be rescued. And then he pleads, hey, this one place that you'd set your sight on, there's not a lot of people that live there. I mean, they're really bad, but it's not as many as, in Sodom. Could I live there? I guess. We'll let that whole town live. It's a small town, but we'll let them live for the sake of the one kind of righteous guy. Like, you see the lesson, like this is, if you are thinking about all this in terms of how does God respond to the righteous when he executes judgment and the wicked, and what is God's forbearance like? What is God's willingness to forbear, to do the right thing, to exact judgment as deserved and no more? You can learn a massive amount in this chapter, and this is why it's here. This is a lesson for Abraham. That's why Abraham found out about it. They deserved what they got anyway, these people did. But the reason Abraham knew about it, instead of just thinking, oh, it was a weird natural disaster. Remember that time when that happened? He knows all about what God's judgment is ahead of time so that he can learn all these lessons. And then he gets his reports later, naturally from Lot and time, and he learns even deeper what's going on. What a thing. They said to Lot, behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive. So all of this happens. And they end up out in that city. They're saved, but they don't live there. They go out on this hill, into the hillside, and live in a cave because the citizens are so bad and they can't. Lot's terrified of how bad the people are. What lessons are learned here, though? But the chapter ends, of course, with Lot and his daughters, and just a terrible, however much Lot stood out as being a righteous man when he was living among those in Sodom. Now he's out here by himself in a cave, and the problem is he and his sinful daughter, his sins and his daughter's sins all went with him into the cave. And it's awful. What became of Lot? Well, his family line goes on, but tragically through the most perverse manner possible. And that's how that chapter ends. That's how that's how kind of Lot's part in all this ends. So, what effect does all this have on Abraham? Well, he goes out there and he saw the place burning, the whole valley on fire, and he's terrified. He's in fear. He's learned some of these lessons, but he hasn't learned all of them because he hasn't gotten word from Lot yet. He wouldn't have. He sees all this and he gets out of there. He leaves. He moves on toward chapter 20, verse 1, toward the territory of the Negev, and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. So he gets further away because of the way these people are, and he sees God's judgment. He knows there weren't even 10 righteous there. The place was destroyed. He's very concerned. And he ends up in Gerar. And in this, he hasn't felt evidently this afraid since he's been in Egypt. Maybe he's even more fearful than he was in Egypt. He's got all the reasons not to be afraid. He's got God with him. He who blesses you, I'll bless you. Curses you, I'll curse. Like, don't be afraid. But he's afraid. He shouldn't be, but he is. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she's my sister. Tried it again, didn't he? And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. You see, the problem is, if you're a man like Abraham and you go into a place as a foreigner and you want to have peace with them, the best way to do that, the most sure way to do that, is to have a daughter that you offer the king as a wife. And now there's peace. We're family. We get along. And as long as we don't mess that up, there will be peace. Well, Abraham doesn't have that. He's got a son, but he's got a wife. And as old as she is, he says she's my sister. He lies about her, says she's unmarried. And this, this man Abimelech, as being the ruler of the area, takes her as a wife. Not this time because she's so beautiful, right? But because she's this man's wife and we want peace. He's got a lot of stuff. He's got a lot of, this could go well for us. And so this happens. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night. Now just understand, it's not as though God intervened and didn't let this happen. This did happen. Sarah was taken as this guy's wife. Behold, God says to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he just it was an official arrangement, right? You can imagine, with her age, it's not like he was eager to consummate the marriage, right? So he's got her as a wife, but he definitely, she's just part of the harem, and she's just kind of there. It's a political formality. As a wife, now he has certain duties to provide for her and protect her, but that's kind of as far as any of this has gone. Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? You won't. That sounds like Abraham a little bit of last chapter, doesn't it? Or 2 chapters ago. Will you kill an innocent person? Right? Will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she's my sister? And she herself, don't think it's just Abraham, she herself lied. She herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I've done this. Yes, I may have taken her as my wife, and she may be his wife, but I was lied to. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. I didn't give you opportunity or the inclination to consummate this marriage. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he's a prophet. Though he's wronged you, he's my prophet. And if you'll return her to him, he will pray for you, and you'll live. But if you do not return to her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. You and all the people who are under you will die. So what would you do if you were Abimelech? Well, he rose early in the morning and called all the servants and told them all these things. And the men were very much afraid. Why were they all so afraid? And that'll come up in a minute. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? And Abraham said, I did it because I thought there's no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do to me at every place to which we come. Say of me, he is my brother. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you. To Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So this whole time this is going on, none of the people over whom Abimelech rules are able to get pregnant. They're miscarrying. They're not getting pregnant. Stillborns, maybe. All these kids are dying. Nobody's given birth. And so then when with that in the background, when God shows up and says, this is all happening because you have this man's wife, return him or I'm going to kill all of you. Like, there's teeth to that. It's not just like a threat. It's more than that. He's already been experiencing. They have been seeing this for a while, which is why Abimelech calls all the men to him and says, I know why this plague has been happening to us. This is what we must do. But as much as this man deserves our anger and our wrath and our retribution, our people have died because of him. He's God's man and we can't touch him. So we won't touch him. And so very much like one king who's been commanded by a much more powerful king who could wipe him out, he does exactly what he's told. He makes all the gestures he can make to show that he's trying his best to not to harm Abraham in any way. He gives him 1,000 pieces of silver for Sarah as a testimony that they were innocent, nothing happened, no shame brought here. He goes out of his way. And then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and the female slaves so that they all bore children. What a thing. God saved the blessing. Abraham had again, this time in fear, risked everything. This time, when Egypt, he didn't have a word about Sarah specifically having a child. But here, Sarah will have a child. And then he gives her away to some other guy. What was he thinking? He says, I was afraid. I thought there's no fear of God here. And when God called us out here and made us go out here and He chose us, if I'm going to follow Him, He says, you go out there and wander around. And I was terrified, and I told my wife, this is the favor you got to do to me. This is our plan, how we're going to live. We got it all worked out. Whether God protects us or not, we're going to protect ourselves. And I was terrified, and that's why I did this. So Abraham left, seeing what happened in Sodom, in fear, and ran out, moved to another place, believing there's no fear of God at all in this place. And when he gets to Gerar, he feels the same thing about these people. It's a different people, different culture, but there's still no fear of God at all, which he was wrong. They actually acted in more fear of God than he did. So now, what do we come to now? Now we have the next chapter, chapter 21. Abraham's learning much. They're progressing, and what happened? About a year goes by. The Lord visited Sarah as He had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as He had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. Laughter. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. And everyone who hears will laugh over me. They'll rejoice. They'll laugh, rejoicing at this. And the unlikelihood of this scenario, and the idea of a 90-year-old woman giving birth, and all of this, it just seems impossible. 100-year-old man, here is dad, And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Well, God would say it. Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast in the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing in mockery, right? Mocking him. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Before, when Sarah was cruel to Hagar, Hagar fled. This time, Ishmael's being cruel to Isaac and vindictive toward Isaac and hateful and resentful toward the blessings that are coming Isaac's way. And Sarah recognizes that and sees it. And knowing what God had promised to Abraham, she has wisdom and she says, listen, cast him out. Cast out his mother, cast him out, send them away. She's not trying to punish them. She's trying to make sure this doesn't go badly in the future. And Abraham rejects that. He doesn't want to do that, but God comes to Abraham and says, look, do what she said. She's right. And so he sends them out. And he sends them out not with great gifts, but just a small gift. He rose early in the morning, verse 14, and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered into the wilderness of Beersheba. She's just kind of winging a prayer. She's out there with supplies to kind of get to the next town, basically, and that's it. Well, she doesn't make it, tragically. And what we see there is, in this chapter, is one, Abraham's faithfulness to, he loves Ishmael still, but God's saying, no, you do what I'm commanding you to do. I've made a covenant with you, that matters. So Abraham, this time, is willing to deny himself and his own desire and his love for Ishmael in order to follow God and do what God said for the covenant and for the promises. And doing that, he knows, puts Hagar and Ishmael at risk, but he's got to do it. Hagar and Ishmael are at risk. They're so ill-equipped to go out and make their way in the world. They find themselves trapped in the desert, dying. But God, in faithfulness to His promises earlier made to Hagar and to Abraham concerning Ishmael, shows up, rescues them, and does, the rest of the chapter, the rest of the section, in fact, begins to make a great nation of Ishmael. And we find that in fulfillment later on. God heard them and rescued them. Now, then at the end of this chapter, verse 22 to the end, we have Abimelech come, and after some time has passed, and Abraham had lied to him about his wife before, but now he comes back and he says, look, we see God is with you in everything that you do, so we want a covenant treaty between us. Verse 23, now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my descendants or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. And so they had that agreement. But then Abimelech wasn't really living up to it. And Abraham comes again and just acts in kindness, not to retaliate when he was mistreated, but to be a blessing, to seek to have to go out of his way to make a kind gesture to Abimelech and covenant again with him. And that's all I'm going to say about the rest of that chapter, just in the interest of time. Abraham is learning, he's growing, he's becoming something different. The title of the message today is The Growth of a Soul for the Growth of the Promise. The growth of a soul for the growth of a promise. And the soul we see growing and deepening and becoming more godly is Abraham's. And never is that more evident than in Genesis chapter 22. After these things, God tested Abraham. He did what? He tested him. The whole point of this is God's testing him. And said to him, Abraham, and he said, here am I. And he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. What? That's the test. Go offer your son up as a burnt offering. That's a test. But Abraham knows clearly it's God, and he knows clearly the things God has promised him, and so he agrees. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him, and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the third day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, these servants, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship. And that's a euphemism. By worship he means offer my son as a burnt offering. And then we will come again to you. So there is his confidence, right? Whatever it is God has commanded me, I know that in that path God will also fulfill His promises. It doesn't matter how contradictory these two look. God's promised me these things. I believe what He said. In Isaac shall my offspring be named. It's going to be in Isaac. Isaac doesn't have any kids yet, so if he dies now, it means God's going to save him or something's going to happen. God's going to interject in this situation in some kind of a way such that Isaac and I both come back. That I know. I don't know how, but I know it's going to happen. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together, and Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. So now it appears that Abraham has a hunch that God might not actually require him to go through with it. Like he's not 100% confident. He's saying God will provide whatever God needs to fulfill all that He's promised to do and to enable us to keep this commandment. God will provide it. God will provide it. Don't you worry about a lamb, son. God's going to provide for Himself a lamb. They come to the place, right? They get to the situation where Abraham's got the knife, his son's bound. He raises the knife up, and God says, "Wait, don't do it." And he looks over there, and there is this ram caught in a thicket. Verse 13, Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Right? That becomes a saying. God commands you to do something, you don't know how He's going to provide. Well, go out there and obey, and you find in the midst of your obedient actions, God will provide. On the mount of the Lord it'll be provided. Don't worry. On the mount of the Lord it'll be provided. And that phrase becomes used two ways. One, the way I just used it, in the midst of your obedience, don't worry, God will provide. And then two, this was a geographical place. And so they'd say, there, if you get to that mountain, God will provide for you. Don't worry, God will provide there on that mountain. And so it became used in those two ways, this statement. But what a thing. So the angel of the Lord then called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have..." Now God had tested him, and he passed the test. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now, there's a little bit more to Abraham's life we'll cover in a second, but I want to say this. There really isn't any more staggering things that Abraham does in his life. But what's curious to me is the way the New Testament describes the reason God swears an oath is to build up your confidence and faith in the one who swears. So God desiring to make Abraham more confident than he currently is, would swear an oath to him. Now, we just saw Abraham was so confident that he was willing to kill his own son, confident that God would have to raise him up. He's at that level of confidence and faith in God. Having done that and passed that test, God then says, I have sworn and I swear to you, this is my oath. This is what's going to happen. God's still trying to build his faith. And you think surely his faith is high enough. Well, I don't know what other things happened in Abraham's life for the rest of his days, but evidently he needed God to keep building his faith due to the things that were going to happen that we're not even told about. This is incredible. Like, this is kind of a high point, we think, but evidently there were more tests. There were more times where Abraham would be tempted not to believe. Even if it was just, perhaps it was even just the distance that would happen in his life between this event and what happens later. You know, when you're not being tested all the time, you kind of grow dull. You're not as sharp as you used to be. Well, you need this loud bullhorn of a message from God, I swear, so that you don't lose faith. You don't forget. I don't know what the reasons were, but God continued to build his faith even after that. It's not as though God just said, oh, okay, my work is done. We've done enough. He trusts me that much. Rather, he swore even more. Swore a fresh oath again to him. What a thing. And then after that happened, it was told to Abraham, behold, Milcah has also borne children to your younger brother Nahor. And he gets word, he gets messages about his brother and all these descendants that his brother had. And that's encouraging. Because you've got a son who's going to need a wife, and there's no fear of God really in this place. And so what are you going to do? So but before he can act, Sarah dies. he wasn't eager to act. Sarah lived 127 years. That means Isaac was 37 years old when she died. And he hadn't had a wife yet. So Abraham wasn't greatly concerned. But to be 37 years old for Isaac and not have a wife means even Isaac is not willing to have, and Abraham so far has not been willing to have a wife for him from among these people. And the time hasn't come yet. They haven't had opportunity to go back and find a wife somewhere else. There's questions about what to do. But in the meantime, Sarah dies, and Abraham wants to find a burial place for her. And in chapter 23 is concerning that. And you might think, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it's here for a couple reasons. One, it's here for the posterity's sake. For the people of Israel, when they come back in the land, they can know that this was done. There's this field that was purchased where there's a legal right to the land even though it wasn't ours. We've had that for hundreds of years before we got back here. This is the place. It functions also in Israel's history before they come back to the land while they're still in Egypt, we saw this later in Genesis, as a connecting point to get them back into the land and thinking about the promises of the land and the future that is there in the land for them. Functions that way as well. Abraham wants to own something here, some piece of land that's theirs, even if it's just a burial plot. Now, back in these days, if you're a foreigner, you don't just get to buy land. You have to go and get approval from everyone in the city, or all their representatives. The elders of the city have to approve that you are allowed to buy some piece of land there because you're a foreigner, and they have this place. And they don't mean to give it up. Land was precious. And so this is the scenario we find Abraham in. He goes to the elders of the city and he says, look, I'm a foreigner. I know I don't have any legal right here, so I want to come and I want to ask you to have, if I can have a place to bury my wife. And they say to him, verse 5, the Hittites answered Abraham, hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince, or a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. So we've got all these graves. You can turn to any of those tombs. He doesn't want their tombs. He doesn't want to bury her in a place with all their little rituals and rites and everything all around. He wants his own place. That's not going to work. They offer any of our tombs, the finest one. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose, so he gets up, and then he bows again to the Hittites, the people of the land, and he said to them, if you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me Ephron the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. This is what he's seeking. He's not going to bury her with these pagans and all that it would look like there in their place. He wants his own place, and he's picked out a field already. Now Ephron happened to be sitting there, right? And without reading through all the rest of the details here necessarily, we might pick up a few verses, but they have this whole back and forth exchange where Abraham the guy says, well, you can just have it. He says, no, I'm not going to do that. What's the price of the field? And then the guy says, oh, it's, we're friends. Like, why? Let me just take it as a gift. What's a field worth 400 shekels, which was an exorbitant amount of money? And he knows if he says that, Abraham either has to beg off and give this man the great honor of having given away the field, which Abraham's not likely to do because Abraham's already shown, like, no, I'm willing to pay everything. Pay the full price. He already said that. I would pay the full price. So for Abraham, he says, I'll pay the full price. That's kind of in this society especially, it's kind of a boast. I mean, he's not boasting, but they would see it as an honor mark, like, I'm gonna, like you might think of a dowry for a bride. What kind of price did she fetch? How worthy was she? How wonderful of a bride was she? How much did you have to pay? Well, here it is, like, I'm willing to pay full price to bury my wife. Oh, full price it is. Okay, well, no. I would just soon give it to you. Well, if Abraham says, okay, I'll take it for nothing, then like you've not honored your wife, you've gone back against your word, you can't be trusted, you've let this man be the bigger man, right? And that might be what all he's concerned about, but Abraham, he said he'd pay the full price, he's going to pay the full price. So he insists on that, and that guy says, no. I mean, what's a field worth 400 shekels? It'd be like me saying, what's a house worth $500,000? You can have my house. You don't need to pay me the deserved price of $500,000 for my house. It's not necessary. I would just give it to you. And It's like, now that you said the price, I mean, if I haggle, I can't really, I mean, I might be able to say, guys, is that really the price? Is that? And they might say, no, it's not the price. That's not worth that. But Abraham just goes out of his way and says, okay, I'll pay it. Done. You want, that's the price? Then you can have it. Now I've got my burial place. And so you see here that Abraham, he's not a conniver. He's not trying to just get the deal. He's willing to be taken advantage of to do the honorable thing. And so you see another area where he's grown, he's matured. So there's some of the details, no doubt, are recorded for us for that reason as well, to see the ongoing growth of Abraham in his maturity, the way he continues to pass tests. He's speaking here like one who's not worried about being taken advantage of, but who has the confidence of knowing that God has sworn an oath to him that these things will in fact come to pass, and he doesn't need to worry about being, not getting the best deal possible for this graveside. It's okay. Let the man, take advantage of him. So this field is then made over, the field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burial place by the Hittites. Now, so the next chapter we read about God's faithfulness to Abraham. Abraham's got a son. He doesn't have a wife. I mean, it's amazing. God swore an oath to him that, all these things are going to happen. But now Abraham he's going to be a father of a multitude of nations, but he doesn't have a wife. He's got one son. All the other sons he's sent away. He's got one son. And we learn later he's got these concubines, but he understands that doesn't apply, and he sends those kids away as they come. But so he's got one son, or at least he eventually has these concubines, but he's got one son, and his son doesn't have a bride, and there's nobody around to marry. And Abraham's getting ready to die, he feels like. He's getting very, very old. Was old, well advanced in years. He'd blessed him. God had blessed Abraham in everything. Abraham said to his servant, verse 2, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from among the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. In short, that's what happens. And they have an exchange, and the deal is, okay, I'll go there and I'll do what you say, but if nobody is willing to come with me, then your son might have to marry somebody from here. So it's okay. And so there's kind of two challenges. One, can the servant go? Well, he's got to go make the journey. He's got to get there. And then he's got to find a woman who he thinks is suitable for Isaac, who would be an honor to Abraham. He wants to honor his master here and find a remarkable woman. And yet, how's he going to convince the woman to come with him? So you've got two challenges. And God overcomes both of them. And so he gets there, right? And he finally comes to the land, and he's to the city of Nahor, where these people live, the city where Nahor had lived, and so there he is, and he's out in the field, and he sees people drawing water. Men in the city, daughters and men of the daughters are coming out to draw water. He just thinks, well, how am I going to? How do I know who to pick? So he has this idea, like, how about a woman of character? What? All right, Lord, if there's a woman here who will, it's hard enough getting this water for their family, but if they will stop what they're doing and offer me water and also water all these animals, then that's a woman of character, and that'll be the one. And this is what happens. This woman comes up named Rebekah, and she does all those things exact. In verse 26, the man bowed. How did he respond? The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master." He sees it. He interprets it. This is how we should interpret it, right? The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master Abraham. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman. I came right up upon his kinsman." Then the young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. Laban ran out toward the man to the spring. As soon as he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms and heard the words of Rebekah his sister, "Thus the man spoke to me," he went to the man. And behold, as he was standing by the camels at the spring. And Laban said, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord." Laban says, "Oh, come in, O blessed of the Lord." Think of this. They had known Abram to leave. All on, well, this God who, appeared to me, he said he'd do all these things, and we don't know, we don't know him. He's not the God we've worshiped, but I'm going out there and venturing on this fact that he's going to bless me, as he said. I think, well, you go ahead, we're staying here. And then years later, here comes this servant saying, yeah, God's blessed this guy. And he's led me right here to you, and I set this test up, and you're supposed to be his wife. And Laban hears that and comes right out and says, you're blessed of God. This God who Abraham went out and followed has blessed him. In other words, the experiment, the test that Abraham went out on, venturing out on God, has worked. God has proven to be true, to be able to provide even in a distant land for Abraham. And Laban recognizes that. And so the feeling in the camp is that God is this powerful God is with Abraham, and now Abraham has sent his servant here to get a wife, and God has worked it out in such a way that we all know who that wife is supposed to be. It's the will of this God that this woman be sent back and marry this man. That's the feeling in camp. That's the operating premise. So he goes and he gives a further report about all this to the family. And pick up in verse 42. I came today to the spring and said, O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, if now you are prospering the way that I go, behold, I am standing by the spring of water. Let the virgin who comes out to draw water, to whom I shall say, please give me a little water from your jar to drink, and who will say to me, drink, and I will water your camels also. Let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son. Before I had finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her water jar on her shoulder, and she went down to the spring and drew water. And I said to her, please let me drink. She quickly let down her jar from her shoulder and said, drink, and I will give your camels drink also. So I drank, and she gave the camels drink also. Then I asked her, whose daughter are you? And she said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him, which is where I was sent to find this family. So I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her arms. Then I bowed my head and worshipped the Lord and blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me by the right way to take the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. Now then, if you are going to show steadfast love to my master, which God has been showing, tell me, and if not, tell me, that I may turn to the right hand or to the left. And then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, this thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you bad or good. So they're like, we're not going to get in the way. This God who he ventured out on is the one who's arranged all this. We're not about to interfere. They're not really for it. They're just saying, well, it's the will of the gods. It's the will of this God in particular. And he's been so faithful, and he's done so much for Abraham. We didn't think he had a wing and a prayer going out there, but look what's happened. God has provided. So, behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go. And let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. It's fine with us. We're not going to interfere. When Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself to the earth before the Lord, and the servant brought out jewelry of silver and of gold and garments and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave to her brother and to her mother costly ornaments, and he and the men who were with him ate and drank, and they spent the night there. Think of the way that this family feels that they're honored, that God himself has, from the distant land, has chosen their daughter Rebekah to marry this man. All these things have worked out. It's the will of God to do this. When they arose in the morning, he said, send me away to my master. Like, guys, let me go. I want to get back right away. But her brother and her mother said, listen, I know that we'd said, so this is interesting. When it was the father and the brother, they said, it's the will of God. We're not going to stand in your way. But now, after the night, the next morning, it's the brother, Laban, and the mom who are like, let's make sure she's okay with it. So you kind of see the mother's influence here? When it was the dad and the brother like, oh, it's the will of God, just let it happen. But after the night, it's like they wake up in the morning and mom's kind of said her 2 cents, and now they're saying, the mom and the brother are saying, hey, let's just make sure she's okay with it, right? Mom's not so ready to give up her daughter here. Her brother and her mother said, let the young woman remain with us a while, lest at least 10 days, and after that she may go. But he said to them, do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master. We're not waiting 10 days. Then they said, let us call the young woman and ask her. And they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I'll go. I'll go. This God who has been proven so faithful has chosen me to go. I'll go. I'll venture out and we'll see what happens. And she goes. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate them. And she leaves, and she finds Isaac, and then Isaac sees her and is comforted by taking this wife after his mother had died. And then we read about the death of Abraham, the end of his life. Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. He has a number of concubines, and they have children, and he sends them all away one by one. They reach a certain age of maturity. He sends away the concubine and the child with gifts, setting them up in some way, giving them in the world. They're still going to benefit from having Abraham as a father. He's a wealthy man, but everyone is sent away, and the only one living with him is Isaac. Verse 7, these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahai. So God, you see again God's faithfulness. After Abraham died, this mark of blessing, this regular activity of blessing moved not to Ishmael as God said, but rather as God said to Isaac. And faithfully it settled on Isaac, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahai. So what we see with Abraham in his life and God's dealings with him is not the building of a city, the establishment of a nation, but rather lessons of faith. And we see promises spoken, covenants made, which will lay the foundation for the faith of future generations. We see lessons about righteousness and judgment, lessons about blessing, lessons about integrity, lessons about the life he's supposed to live, the kind of man he's supposed to be, lessons about forgiveness and patience and tolerance. We see all these kinds of lessons in his life. And when God set out to establish a nation through whom he would work in the world, he didn't establish a city and build a wall and a fortress and create borders. That's not how this began. He began teaching a man about his character and making promises to the man and revealing things about himself to him. And this is staggering. It's like the most important things are these things. This is where we start. It's like, well, we're going to start build a nation for God. And you might think, well, we've got to have a nation, we've got to have land, we've got to have all this stuff, No, that'll come later. God will take care of that in the meantime. Right now, we need to be concerned about the character of people and get out of their heads all these pagan ideas and get into their heads a knowledge of the true God. This is what God does. This is how the whole thing begins. The growth of a soul for the growth of the promise. Well, that's Abraham's life. We've kind of covered it all very quickly. There are lessons here that we've not considered, but in the main, in terms of the thrust of things, I feel like we've hit everything. Are there questions or comments about this portion of Abraham's life, or even maybe from before that you want to ask about? It's kind of the last time we will, in this study of Genesis, consider Abraham. So, now's your chance. Questions or comments?